Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Fantasy Flight Games' 6th edition of Legends of the Five Rings and what it means for the entire industry and why this game is so very, very important to the entire tabletop role-playing game industry. Alright, well, I'm not going to bury the lead. The reason why this game is so very, very important to the entire industry is it is a third ratcheting back of the lever of custom dice. So Legends of the Five Rings, the new tabletop role-playing game by Fantasy Flight Games, the 6th edition of the game within 21 years, is now out. It has new art, it has new aspects to the setting, and most importantly, important for the entire industry, it has brand new custom dice that are specific to Legends of the Five Rings, okay? And this is really, really important at the industry level, and I'm going to talk about why. All right, so one, I want to talk about the dice themselves real quick. The dice for Legends of the Five Rings 6th edition by Fantasy Flight Games are specific to that game. They come in black D6s painted with red symbols that are in the style of the feudal Japanese style of Legends of the Five Rings, okay? They have, and also there are white D12s with the same symbols written on them and also blank spaces on the dice, okay? Which means that these dice are specifically styled for Legends of the Five Rings and can only be used for Legends of the Five Rings. They are specific to that game, right? This is a big, big deal. And the reason why is because it is being done by Fantasy Flight Games. Now, Fantasy Flight Games, probably like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, got the Star Wars license. They were the third company to own the Star Wars license. The Star Wars tabletop role-playing game license was held by West End Games, and then it was held by Wizards of the Coast, and then it was held by Fantasy Flight Games. Fantasy Flight Games has by far done the very best job of realizing the value of the Star Wars TRPG franchise and delivering value for themselves and for the owner of Star Wars, okay, which at this point is Disney. All right, now how did they do that? Well, one of the ways they did that was with custom dice. They created custom dice that were specific to the Star Wars setting. They're narrative dice. They don't have numbers, they have symbols on them, which is the same as what's happening in the Legend of the Five Ring dice, okay? So those dice were setting specific. Now, these narrative dice, this is the first time this was ever done at scale by a large company that actually is a brick and mortars tabletop role-playing game. A company that actually has a physical place where people go every day to work. That's a big deal in the tabletop role-playing game, in the tabletop role-playing industry. There are many, many, many companies who have no physical place and literally are like garage companies. People are just putting together, material in their garages on the weekend. No shame in that game, but they also have a challenging time competing with very robust companies like Fantasy Flight Games, where people have 401ks with these companies. It's that kind of level, right? It's a different level of business, and that's what Fantasy Flight Games is saying. We are doing in the tabletop role-playing game industry, we are doing business at a different level. So we can go to a meeting in Disney, and which is a multi-billion-dollar company, and we don't need to sweat the thousands of dollars it would take to get to fly out 3-4 employees, whereas another company that could break the entire company, and so their inability to just do that could break a deal with a billion-dollar company, right? And so what it takes to get a company to be able to deal with tabletop role-playing games at this level is pretty immense, right? So the first thing that FFG did when it had the Star Wars license, right, was the first thing it did to really make sure that it could deliver real, actual money, right? Millions of dollars, I'm expecting, right? from a tabletop role-playing game, which are traditionally incredibly difficult to deliver money from, was not the narrative dice. What they did was they cut the game into 3 core rule books, right? Where they could literally sell the same rules in 3 different ways. They have a Princesses and Pilots book, they have a Bounty Hunters book, and they have a Jedi book, right? And those are not source books. Those are individual core rule books, each costing like $60, right? So in order to get into a Star Wars tabletop role-playing game, a game master can easily spend. You need to really drop $300 bare minimum to be a good, solid, respectable Star Wars DM, right? And you can easily drop $1,000 on that game. And there are thousands of dungeon masters that have done that, and they are delivering cash to Disney in at least wheelbarrow amounts. You know what I mean? Maybe you're not backing up a dump truck, but you're certainly at least filling cash with the wheelbarrows, right? FFG is doing it again. The fact that they are now releasing Legends of the Five Rings with its own custom dice that are not the Genesis dice, okay? So FFG did Star Wars. They did those custom dice. They allowed that to generate real profit so they could hold on to a real license. And they did hold on to that real license. And if you don't think that's a big deal, it absolutely is. The last company to have a license at this scale was Margaret Weis Productions. They had the Marvel tabletop role-playing game. They lost that license, had to give the license up. The company has never been the same. I'm not even sure if they're still printing books, right? And then in addition to not only losing the license for that, right, Marvel and DC are both now completely out of print in any tabletop role-playing game. So the fact that FFG still holds the Star Wars license deal is a huge deal within the tabletop role-playing game industry, because traditionally tabletop role-playing games have delivered change, just like the barest amount of change for companies, right? And that's one of the reasons why Harry Potter, right, does not have a tabletop role-playing game, and it's arguable it may never have a tabletop role-playing game, right? So holding on to licenses and delivering real money for real companies is extremely challenging. And FFG is saying, we are the company in the tabletop role-playing industry that is going to do this at scale and is going to do the very best job possible, okay? Legends of the Five Rings is part of this, right? So, FFG created Star Wars. Then it realized we may lose the Star Wars license at some point. You know, we're doing the best we can to keep it, but what if we lose it? Well, one of the things they did was they took the entire Star Wars narrative dice system and they converted it over to a generic system that they can use for any game, which they've now released Realms of Terrinoth under, and that generic GURP style, play anything you want type of game is called Genesis. It is an excellent game. The dice are really cool. They're a reskin of the Star Wars dice, right? So you have an iteration of making dice a profit center. FFG is making dice a profit center, and it totally works. One of the things I realized is I paid $40 for the Genesis system, and I have $80 in dice for the Genesis system, right? So there you're talking about literally double the amount paid for the books being paid for custom dice, okay? Now, FFG is iterating. They're going Star Wars. They're going Genesis. Now, Fantasy Flight Games is the next one. And they actually did a post. Max Brook is one of their designers. And he talked about this. He said, well, listen, we have this L5R game, right? Why don't we just make it Genesis? Everybody, all of our player and our community base said, oh, that's great. I'm looking forward to seeing L5R as a Genesis game, and I can use the narrative dice. And they said, no, we're not doing that. This game has a tradition of keep and roll, and it has a beautiful, luxurious theme. And we want to give tradition to the keep and roll dice system for this game, and we want to reflect the beautiful setting of this game within the dice. And so Legends of the Five Rings is not is not a Genesis game. It does not use the Genesis dice. It uses custom dice that are specific to Legends of the Five Rings. This is a huge, huge deal because it forces every single tabletop role-playing game designer, every TRPG publisher to look up and realize that these guys are ratcheting back the lever of profit on a tabletop role-playing game. They're saying, we don't just make profit on simply the, we don't just make profit alone on the books, we make profit on the dice, right? And the other thing is, if some regular company, if some other company was doing this, you probably would not need to worry about it, right? But this is FFG. They execute at an incredibly high rate. They execute almost flawlessly on their content. They execute with, their execution is very high, their style is very high. These are just things that can't be ignored, right? And their quality is very high. So their style is high, their execution rate is high, their quality rate is high, right? These are all really important, especially within the tabletop role-playing game industry. These guys swing, like, they take big, big swings, and that's what this is, right? And so one of the things that this says now is they're saying it's not enough for us to have the #1 license in tabletop role-playing games, and without a doubt, the Star Wars is the #1 licensed property in TRPGs. They're saying it's not enough for us to have our own custom dice narrative system that you can, generic system that anyone can tell any story with. It's not enough for us. That's not enough. We are now establishing within the tabletop role-playing game industry that real companies, robust companies, actually make their dice theme-based and specific to the actual game, right? Now, I can hear you. You're going, wait, what about people who don't have money for that? Well, guess what, right? FFG, I think, is recognizing a reality of the tabletop role-playing game industry, okay? At the macro level. I'm not talking about exceptions. I'm not talking about one-offs. There certainly are exceptions to this. There certainly are one-offs. At the macro level, rich people play tabletop role-playing games. At minimum, middle class do. There are not a lot of poor people playing tabletop role-playing games. Now, this is definitely a chicken or an egg, right? Is it that poor people aren't interested in tabletop role-playing games because it requires 300 to 900 pages of reading to play a tabletop role-playing game? Or are people rich because they're really interested in reading 300 to 900 pages of content? It's a good question, right? Actually, it's isn't even important to the point that FFG is getting to. They are realizing tabletop role-playing games overall are being sold to middle class and rich people. So if they are middle class and they are rich, they certainly have enough money to pay for more than just a book. They have the money to pay for not just a set of dice, but 6 to 12 sets of dice. That's what I generally buy for their custom games. I've done that so far for Star Wars. I've done that so far for Genesis. And in addition to that, there is the issue of, oh yeah, and now I need to decide if I'm going to do that for Legends of the Five Rings. So, Fantasy Flight Games is prompting that, right? And so the entire industry is saying, oh man, if we don't make custom dice for our game, we are leaving money on the table. And FFG is already proving this. They're saying this could be in every single TRPG, and we could say, oh, you're giving your money for dice to Chessex and not keeping it for yourself, right? Well, you're amateur. That's rank amateur. That is the gauntlet that FFG is throwing down, right? That is huge. Legends of the Five Rings 6th edition by Fantasy Flight Games is a huge clarion call to the entire industry saying, you better recognize where money is, right? And that's big. It demands response from every single TRPG designer. And what? Custom dice for Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition? Custom dice for Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition? Did you say custom dice for Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition? Nobody has said that yet. But I will guarantee that is now a conversation. It has to be. All right, thank you. That's my thought. I'd love to know what you think. Please consider liking and subscribing. Take care.